Just a while ago, I spent several months in Israel on sabbatical study. And one day we were on the shore of Capernaum on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee. And our guide pointed over to the west to a break in the hills, and he said, "You see that? That's the Valley of the Doves. That's the way Jesus would have gone when he went home." Home. I remember being so struck by the word. Certainly I knew that Nazareth was Jesus' boyhood home. But going home is much more a matter of the heart than a matter of distance. Wouldn't it be wonderful, I thought, if time meant nothing and we could talk to a man who grew up with Jesus and we could listen to his stories? I imagined such a man. Not a Christian, just a boyhood friend of Jesus who agrees to speak to us. He might even be reluctant to begin because he would wonder how we could possibly understand. For this was a matter of the heart between him and Shua. His real name was Yeshua. But when I was young, I couldn't say all that. I just said Shua, and the name caught on. Just so you understand, I was an only child, and my mother died in childbirth. As a result, my father was a savagely bitter man. I was terrified of him. When I was small, I went looking for someone to love me. I found Shua. My first memory of him was when we were 6. I think it was 6. It was a market day. That was always the day before Sabbath. And the farmers came into town to sell grain and sat along the wall near the well. And Miriam, Shua's mother, was taking him with her to buy grain, and I tagged along, and so did Aaron, a little runt of a kid that could always make us laugh. Miriam went straight to her favorite dealer, a surly-faced farmer named Uriah, who had only one tooth left in all his head. And I wondered why Miriam went to him. I soon found out. He took her jar, he filled it with grain, he shook it, and then he filled it again, letting it settle. The other dealers didn't do that. And he did something else. We kids wore this linen smock that came down to just about here. And he pinched the front of Shua's smock and made a pocket and poured in more grain, a bonus. And every little bit of grain was precious to us. Well, buying grain was also a chance for the women to share news and gossip, and as a result, the three of us at 6 years old got very restless, and I dared Shua to run back across the marketplace to his house without spilling any grain. He hesitated, and I double dared him. He clutched the grain to his chest and bolted, and Aaron and I took off after him, screaming and shouting like crazy men, scattering chickens and knocking down a few toddlers, and behind me I heard the outrage of the women as they started after us. Well, Shua made it to his house without spilling any grain, but then Aaron started doing his imitation of Uriah with the one tooth, and we started giggling, and then Shua started spilling the grain, which was hilarious when you're 6, and we were rolling on the ground, shrieking with laughter and holding our stomachs, and of course grain was everywhere. Aaron and I heard the women coming, and we got out of there. But before Shua could move, the birds came. Now, we have more sparrows in my village than we have people. And I believe that this day there may have been every sparrow in Galilee invited to the banquet of grain on the ground. Down they came, and at first Shua tried to defend himself against them, but then he became spellbound. He wandered into them and lifted with his hands like this, and of course they all rose up and hovered around, and then they came down again, and he giggled again, and he raised his hands again, and they all went up and circled around, and he started laughing with his head thrown back, and he started spinning around, watching the birds dart around his long fingers, just laughing, spinning around and around. That's my first memory of him, dancing in ecstasy, while from all sides doom approached. Well, Shua spilled the grain. Aaron made him laugh, but it was my idea, so we were all guilty. You know how mothers think. The punishment was left to our fathers, which meant that I spent the night in terror. When my father got through punishing me, I could barely move. I stood at my doorway in tears, holding my behind, and listening to the sounds that came from Shua's house. Ow! Ow! For it says in Proverbs, a man who does not discipline his son does not love him. And we were loved. The problem with my father was he couldn't tell the difference between discipline and cruelty. In fact, I think it never occurred to him to see any difference at all, if he ever loved me at all. And so I took to spending more and more time at Shua's house and visiting with him and thinking of his parents as my own. I became little brother. And after a while, that's what I called Shua, my brother. Our village was in a bowl in the hills, and Shua loved to run up and down those hills as often as he could. I'd be sitting in the square, and he'd go tearing through, and I'd say, "Where are you going, Shua?" And he'd say, "Come on, come with me." And together we'd scramble up that stony, steep path that led up between the houses, dodging garbage and debris and what we used to call stinky stuff, and climbing up to air and freedom. He was tall and skinny, and his long legs would take him up faster than me, and I'd have to say, wait for me!" And he'd say, "Oh, come on!" But he'd wait, and then we'd go up together. One time, it could have been one of many, my father was enraged at me for something, and after he had given me the usual beating, he shook me by the hair so badly I begged him to stop, and he threw me bodily out of the house. I sat in the square just crying my eyes out in shame and humiliation. Shua came by and he saw me. I had bitten through my lip, and I saw him staring at it. "Where are you going, Shua?" I said. "Where are you going?" "Come on," he said. And together we went up to the hills. We sat on our favorite rocky ledge overlooking the plain of Esdraelon, and he let me tell him all about my father and me, and he put his arm around me, and he let me cry, and we sat. After a while, we talked about all the famous battles that had gone on in the plain down below. The day wore on, but we just sat and swung our legs